In the summer of 2003, I began filming the series Atheism, A Rough History of Disbelief. As part of the process, I talked to a number of writers, scientists, historians, and philosophers. Having secured their cooperation, I was very embarrassed to find that a large proportion of what went on ended up on the cutting room floor, simply because the series would have lasted 24 hours otherwise. Well, as it happens, the BBC agreed with me that the conversations were too interesting to be junked. And with these 6 supplementary programmes, they've made the extremely unusual decision to go back to the original material and to broadcast at length some of the conversations which I had. Conversations with people such as the English biologist Richard Dawkins, the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, the Cambridge theologian Dennis Turner, the American playwright Arthur Miller, the English philosopher Colin McGinn, and the American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg. One of the first people I talked to on making the series on atheism was the Cambridge theologian Dennis Turner, whose inaugural lecture on taking up the chair of theology was entitled How to Be an Atheist. Well, as it happens, the conversation we had was never included in the final series, since it turned out to be much more to do with the current relationship between theology and philosophy than it was about the history of disbelief. However, Professor Turner's theological arguments were so interesting and so forceful that I'm pleased now to have the opportunity to show them at their full length. Well, Dennis, I'm reluctant, as you'll see for reasons which we'll discuss, to use the word atheism of myself. I'm reluctant to call myself an atheist, but I get the impression from your inaugural lecture that you feel that us atheists, if I can use that term of ourselves, have somehow, A, missed the target, and also that from the title of your lecture, that atheism is an achievement of some sort, or it's something which one can get good at, and one can do it badly or achieve it badly. Now, I wonder if you could explain to me, first of all, why it is you feel that atheism is something which you have to practice, and practice makes perfect, and we've got it wrong.
Well, I think that you've got to find a way of avoiding a certain kind of question if you're going to be a proper card-carrying atheist. I think one begins to be a theist, to start at that end, when one realises that there's a certain kind of question which gets swept off the agenda. And my point was you have to work quite hard to ensure that question doesn't keep on re-emerging. And that question is the question, why is there anything at all? As distinct from, well, how are things, given that we've got them? And I think it takes quite a lot of work, really, to be sure that your position is secure against that kind of question re-emerging, and I think it just does. Marx once said that each age asks only such questions as it can answer, and it's the cutting back on the agenda of questions which seems to me to be the important issue here. I mean, even more important than the question of whether God exists is the question of what questions are legitimate. And the standard answer to, I suppose, the theistic position in our time is that the question which the name God appears to be some sort of answer to doesn't make sense as a question, gets ruled out. So it's the agenda of questions which is where I would start. And why is it that that a culture limits itself to asking, as it were, a set of routine questions which it has handily the methodologies for answering? It's almost as if the methods we've got for answering questions dictate what questions we allow to be asked. And I just think that there's a very troubling question which kind of niggles on the edge of all the other questions.
Well, if we can get back to that bigger and more awkward question, but return for the moment to the card-carrying atheist.
Yeah.
I always get the impression that the card carriers, and there were more of them, as you say, once than there are now, is it not the case that the reason why there were so many explicit article-writing, card-carrying atheists who, as it were, affirmed their position and recruited people and so forth. People like Bradlaugh, for example, or Annie Besant, and John Stuart Mill, for instance. The reason why they were so explicitly card-carrying was that they were up against a formal institution which forbade there being a disbelief.
Sure. I mean, those were the days when it was intellectually interesting to be a card-carrying atheist. I think it ceased to be intellectually interesting, which is why I find the likes of a card-carrying atheist like Richard Dawkins to be really just an inverted image of a certain kind of rather narrowed-down theism. There's a sort of fundamentalism about Dawkins' atheism which matches, as in the reversing of a mirror image, that which he's rejected. And it seems to me there's a certain locking of that card-carrying atheist into a fixed form of theism which it opposes, which, if you like, also matches on the atheist side the refusal to ask certain sorts of questions on the theistic side. To give you a practical example, it seems to me that if you suppose that in this world there is a space which must be occupied by evolution, and that whatever space is occupied by evolution God has to be excluded from, then it doesn't really matter which way around you have it. If you're an evolutionary theorist, you're going to have to exclude God. If you're a theist of the same sort, then you're going to have to exclude evolution. And there's, as it were, an equivalent fundamentalism on either side, which is why I think much more troubling to a theist is the position of indifference than that of militant atheism.
Well,
your position as distinct from Dawkins, for example.
Now, I want to ask you then, why is it troubling to you that there should be people like myself for whom it's a matter of indifference, to whom, to speak for myself, the question really never occurred. It never entered my mind when I was a child. I heard people using this strange glottally stopped monosyllable and never knew what it was they were talking about.
I prefer a more intellectually exciting life than yours. I mean, I think everything does hang on the question of whether God exists or not. And I think that, on the one hand, I'd like to re-educate some of the card-carrying atheists into what it is they should be denying, as distinct from what it is they do deny. On the other hand, it does seem to me that there are questions which remain to be asked, and I think challenging people to ask them, and asking them why it is that when presented with a question, why is there anything at all rather than nothing, they seem to rule it out as an intelligible or sensible question, or at any rate as a question which doesn't matter. It seems to me that it must matter, though in a rather peculiar sort of way. It's not going to make any difference to how you understand the world if the answer is there must be something which accounts for the fact that there is anything rather than nothing. It accounts for the existence of what there is, not for the kind of thing, kind of world that it is. And I think that as Wittgenstein said, it's not how the world is, but that it is that is the cause of astonishment. And I think I'd just like to try and arouse people to a stronger sense of that astonishment, that there is anything at all. Well, there might not have been.
Well, you see, while I think there is something startling and remarkable about the fact that there is something, and that it never ceases to amaze, and to produce all the feelings which religious people of various denominations say, where do you get your spiritual feelings from? Now, I hate to use the word spiritual, but the feelings of awe or splendor, or what Freud referred to as oceanic feelings that I get, are as suddenly catching myself out and saying, it's amazing that that my consciousness exists and that my consciousness has content at all. But where I find I differ from you, even in this attenuated, non-idolatrous form of theism, is that if you can ask the question, why is there anything at all, and the answer to that seems to be, there is something which accounts for it, then I find myself, well, why is there God then? Why does the question not go into a series of infinite regresses, asking the question about why the cause of it all, or the bringer about of it all, does not itself, himself or herself, require some sort of
But now you see, you and I are engaged in an argument. I mean, we could have a discussion about that, and a very complex and detailed discussion about it. And it just seems to me that that's where I would want to start, with a sense that there is a problem here. And that there is a problem here at least moves one away from that condition of absolute intellectual indifference to the question of God. There is a fight on now, and it seems to me we're back, as it were, in the days where it mattered what answer one gave to that.
Well, I
haven't answered your question, but I'm simply saying that you're engaging with me on that question is already, in my book, to be doing something called theology.
Why does it have to be called theology rather than an extension of what one would call natural science, which has taken many unpredictable turns to include, for example, a truly unseen world, a world of atoms, which we will never see, and then a world of subatomic particles, field forces and so forth, and indeed degrees of uncertainty, which seem to be mathematically describable. Those themselves are opening up all sorts of possibilities within the sphere of natural science, which doesn't seem to require something beyond as an explanation.
Yes, I'm not sure that it does have to be called theology, and I wouldn't bother about names there, but there is a reason, it seems to me, why it can't just be an extension of natural science. It seems to me that there is all the difference in the world between a question concerning how things are and a question concerning that things are, a question which has to do with the fact that things are, if you see what I mean. Because if you are, as it were, setting that things are against a background of nothingness, then one's beginning to entertain questions about creation. And the classical theistic doctrine of creation is that creation is ex nihilo, out of nothing. Now, it's a curious expression, as Thomas Aquinas pointed out, that nothing isn't a funny kind of something, of any kind. As he said, there isn't a kind of thing that the name nothing names. I mean, there are philosophers who go about as if it did. But Thomas Aquinas was absolutely clear about it. He says, look, it's a very odd sort of making that you're talking about here, because the negation negates the out of. It's a making, but there's no out of going on here.
Yes, but you see, one of the things that always worries me about these fathers and these theologians.
I mention them, by the way, so as to prove that I'm not a one-off, because I mean this is classical theism.
No, I know it's been going on a long time, this sort of stuff, but it always seems to me to be rather similar to the rather brilliant piece of improvisation that my friend John Bird did when he played the Frog Footman in my production of Alice in Wonderland, and he improvised rather brilliantly suddenly in the carol mode when Alice is thundering on the door of the Peppercook's kitchen and she can't get in, and he says to you, I'll tell you what I'll do for you. And then she looks at him questioningly, and he says, I'll tell you what I'll do for you. Nothing. Would that be any good for you? He said, I can't do it straight away because I've got all these things keep propping up. And then he said brilliantly, and in a very Thomistic way, he said, if I was to do nothing for you, I'd have to find the time, see, when I could squeeze it in. Now, there is a beautiful intelligibility about that joke. But the reason why it's a joke is that we know that he's using nothing as if it were something about which we can talk. But then I can't get my mind around the notion of this omnipotent creator existing in this nothingness, who then creates something out of the nothingness or brings something about, leaving the question of why is there a God at all?
Well, I acknowledge the force of your bemusement about that, and of course so do the theologians who say that it couldn't be the case that the God in question was a sort of thing. I mean, the classical theologians say, well, God is not any kind of thing, because if God were a kind of thing, God would just be one of the other kinds of things that there are, only a rather different one. So we're not talking about something that's on the map of creation. We're talking about something which is off the map of creation, which is why what we're talking, how we're talking now, is a kind of bamboozling nonsense, if you like. That's, by the way, called negative theology. That is to say, knowing that you don't know what you're talking about at this stage. And I think that's really what theology is about. It's the sense that on the other side of our language is something which sustains it, which can't be contained within it. And I think this is what Wittgenstein was after at the end of the Tractatus, when he said, well, what underlies how we say things cannot itself be said.
Yes.
And that's what we call God.
But it could also be claimed that what lies beyond the possibility of being expressed or said is something about which you'd better be silent in order not to talk nonsense.
Sure.
And you leave it at that, as Russell said when he was arguing with Father Copleston. You simply have to say, well, that's what there is. But it doesn't seem to me that one can press the reiterated child's questions of why, merely because it has a question mark behind it, to an infinity, merely because you can reiterate at will. Reiteration is not necessarily a sign of continuity.
I agree. I mean, I think there is an argument to be had as to whether the question makes sense, or whether it isn't just, as it were, the irritating, childish pressing of a question beyond all possible meaning. And I think there is a case to be made for saying that the question doesn't make sense. But you can't simply say the world is just a fact, there isn't anything more to be said about it, because that's a refusal to discuss whether the question does or doesn't make sense. I just think there is an argument to be had here. And I think having that argument is, as I say, already beginning to do theology.
Well, as you can see from all this, theology, modern or otherwise, can be maddeningly obscure. But what intrigued me, since Dennis had been quite clear in his lecture that anything that went beyond the idea that God was the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is mere idolatry. What intrigued me was how Dennis was able to apply this notion of God to his daily life. You've already given me a position of an extremely attenuated initial state, or a non-initial state, about which there is a legitimate question to be asked. Now, it seems to me that the way you describe it, it is so attenuated, this nothingness, that I find it hard to, see it as being a content of belief, such that it could animate your life, give energy to your moral existence.
Well, here's a sort of soundbite answer. Russell says the world is just simply given. It's a fact. I would say nearly right, but not quite right, because the world is actually gifted. That is to say, it comes, as it were, as a gift of a certain kind.
In other words, it is given in...
It is given in the sense in which there's a giver.
Yes.
And whatever it is accounts for the fact that there is what there is going to be the giver, the creator, the giver, of this. And so existence is a certain kind of gift. I mean, my existence, or anybody's existence, or that there is anything at all, is in the manner of a gift. And of course, one begins to move further in the direction of what I actually believe about things when we make this move from saying the world is simply given to saying that it has been given to us, that there is an author of it. It is, as it were, given to us by a God who... And a further step down that line is that this is not an ironic gift. This is a gift of a good and loving God. Now, there are all sorts of steps that have to be taken to get from that very, very primitive grid about the Creator up to that sort of point. And there are many obstacles to taking those steps with any degree of confidence. One of them, of course, being the immediate problem, the problem of evil.
Well, let's leave the problem of evil on one side for the moment and talk about the gift and talk about the donor.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that language being what it is, the notion of donation and gift and giving are inseparable from the recipient.
Yes.
Now, what I would like to know is to whom is the gift donated?
Yes.
Now, the only things that are in a position to be conscious recipients are, in fact, human beings. Now, if this donor is preparing this gigantic box of gifts, why is it that it took so long to create the grateful recipient? Why were there eons of non-recipients?
Sure. Is any other world possible than this world? I mean, one can invent possible worlds. In fact, on some account, some cosmologists' account, all the possible worlds do exist. Indeed, they'd have to exist for this world, which we know of, to be the way it is. I mean, it's one of the ways of trying to explain how come we've got what we've got. But leaving that out of the question for the moment, why not this world? Is any other world?
Well, I have to reply to you in all ignorance that I'm not a good enough physicist or mathematician to be able to, as it were, conceive of alternative arrangements of subatomic particles and so forth. But I'd like to leapfrog backwards a little bit. And it raises a question which I think you wanted to ask, and we can ask it between ourselves. The notion of gift presupposes intention. And one of the things which I find, as someone trained in biology, and I think that Richard Dawkins would say this as well, and certainly Daniel Dennett does, that intentions and so forth don't start to appear in the universe until there are entities which have what Dennett would call interests, maintaining themselves. And these don't start to occur until a very, very late in the history of the universe. And I think that it's really putting the cart before the horse to start invoking intentions on the part of this maker, this gift giver, when intending and having purpose seems to be something which occurs only when you get biological systems which have interests, for which there are purposes of self-maintenance and survival.
Sure. I'm not sure in what way I'd want to get the word purpose in here. I mean, I know there are questions about scientific explanation and how far it does or does not involve purposive concepts. I mean, some read evolutionary theory itself in a quasi-purposive fashion, though Dawkins won't. I think an aesthetic account of what's going on here is better than a purposive one, where what one means by purpose is, well, doing things as means towards certain ends, which are the intentions in question. It's much more to do with, when you ask, well, why does the world exist? It's much more like asking, well, why did Mozart write The Marriage of Figaro? Well, there's a quick answer, and he needed money fast. But a much better answer is because it was just a wonderful exercise of his own creative powers in which there was great joy. And it was a great joy, as it were, to those who performed it and then those who listened to it. So the thing is justified simply in terms of its inherent beauty. Now, I think that does connect with gifts, which, of course, etymologically is connected with the word gratuitous. You're not talking about a purpose for which it exists. It exists simply because that sort of thing is beautiful. Now, to say of a thing that is beautiful is to say why it exists. If you ask, well, why beautiful things, then I think you've already misunderstood what beauty means.
I still felt that I was in the dark, and I simply couldn't understand how it could be that the creation was said to be a performance on God's part, carried out for aesthetic reasons, or how this form of Christianity could become a faith that you could practice in church without it being so simplified that it would become, in Dennis's own words, idolatrous. Well, all right, let me accept your claim as you express it.
Sure.
And really press you to say, in what sense, A, is this a Christian theology? And what does it mean, as it were, on Sunday? How does it construct your, as it were, worship? In what sense do you, outside the daily practices of your life, in those parts of your life which you regard as your religious experiences and your religious actions and religious feelings, what does it do? To whom, for example, to what are prayers directed, or are there such things as prayers in this, by your own admission, attenuated form of non-idolatrous religion?
Well, I mean, quite often I suppose that when I think I'm praying, I am simply talking to myself, a kind of inner dialogue and so on. But there are times when it seems utterly at one's wit's end, and it seems clear that, you are utterly at the mercy of something bigger than you are. I mean, when you're at the wit's end, you're not very big. And it's not hard to find something bigger than you are when you're absolutely at the end of your wits.
But even when you're within your wits, you're constantly, unless you're merely, as it were, going about your business, and therefore you're distracted from the largeness of things. What is it that makes the difference between merely saying, what a beautiful sunset, what a vast universe, why am I conscious of anything? How does it differ from those sort of bewilderments and amazements that we all have, unless we're clods?
Yes, I mean, I don't really think it does all that much. I mean, if you're looking at it from the point of view of the experienced feel of it, I don't see that there's any difference at all. I just think that sometimes giving it a name can make all the difference in the world.
But then, for the pious atheist, which I would think of myself as, pious in the sense that I have episodes of piety. They're not episodes of piety in which I am bewildered and find myself asking the question of why it is at all, but find myself shaken to the depths of my being that there is anything at all, and by the strange mysteries of the fact that my scrambled egg in the morning is me by the end of the day. Something as negligible as scrambled egg can become something as part of something as considerable as me, or considerable as anyone. Now, that seems to me to be the most mysterious form of incarnation, much, much grander than what happened in Bethlehem. Now, why do we have to go back to Bethlehem in order to worship the extraordinary majesty of there being anything at all, even without having to invoke an author for it?
Well, you see, I'm not sure that I would actually succeed in getting a merely philosophical argument going, which demonstrated that this fact that there is anything at all is in the way of being a gift of a loving God. I think that would have to be revealed.
Yes.
To be believed. If only for the reason that there's so much counter-evidence.
Yes. Well, then in that case, I want to ask you the question, for the religious person, in what way and in what manner and what episodes of revelation bring it to your consciousness?
Everything. It's either everything, you see, or simply not true. It couldn't be in just some things. It would have to be that creation is like that. Yeah. And therefore everything has to be brought into the story in some way or other. That is to say, I wouldn't be selective about it. I wouldn't want to go down a line in which I said, well, this reveals God, but of course that doesn't. As if you could explain some things in these terms, but other things didn't fit with it, because it seems to me that's intellectually dishonest.
It must be comprehensive.
It's got to be the lot. I mean, you've either got to accept that everything in some way or other reveals God, including failure. And that is the most surprising thought, which is why the central part of the Christian story has to do with the way in which failure works within this. If it weren't the case that everything could be included in the picture of what reveals God, including catastrophic failure, the failure of love, the mystery that if you do love, as Herbert McCabe once put it, if you don't love, you're scarcely alive, but if you do love, you'll almost certainly be killed. That's the story of Jesus, it seems to me. Now, that is a totally inclusive story. That is to say, it says, look, the whole lot, everything about it, is in some way or other a revelation of this mystery of love. It's either the case that everything does, or else your position is correct. That none of it needs to. You can look at it in a different kind of way, and you don't need this story at all.
Yes, for me it is merely the revelation of itself.
Yeah. But you see, I don't think there's any rational argument which would settle the question between you and me. I mean, I think it is a question of faith and whether one can accept it or not at this point. And it seems to me that one is talking about faith precisely at the point where one has gone that step beyond the point where you can have a properly speaking philosophical argument about it. So when you ask me about, well, the content of my belief, we've moved away from that which we can properly dispute, because you either accept my position or you don't.